Good afternoon, and thank you for coming to see us, in particular on such a lovely day. I would like to welcome you to the panel on changing youth values in Southeast Europe beyond ethnicity. We would like to thank our organizers and sponsors, first and foremost the Center for European Studies, but also GSA's Serbian Cultural Club, as well as Harvard College South Slavic Society. The theme of the panel is derived from the book co-edited by two of our panelists, Danilo Mandic and Tamara Pavasovic-Drozd. The title of the book is Changing Youth Values in Southeast Europe, and it was published just recently by Routledge 2018. The book addresses the neglected topic of the European youth in general. Youth that is not directly at the core of the European Union, but is nonetheless deeply embedded in the dialogue about Europe. What does Europe mean? What does it mean to be a European? What does it mean to grow up in Europe as a young person? This book finds that Southeast Europe, even though often overlooked, is a dynamic, culturally hybrid context. The volume includes a number of comparative studies, including in-depth case studies that go beyond the superficial lens of ethnicity as the end-all, be-all lens through which to consider the region. The societies analyzed in this book are not just from the former Yugoslav republics of Croatia, Montenegro, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Serbia, Macedonia, but also Albania, as well as the specific regions with pronounced inter-ethnic mixing, such as Vojvodina and Kosovo. This theoretically innovative and empirically rigorous volume strives to achieve a discourse which balances between majority and minority ethnic groups, as well as between civic and national identities. And perhaps as the best illustration of this volume, I will quote a few sentences by Bart Bonikovsky, who's professor of sociology here at Harvard, and an affiliate of the Center for European Studies. He says, as liberal democracies being increasingly challenged by radical politics, sustained scholarly attention to ethnicity and nationalism is gaining renewed urgency. This excellent and timely volume tackles this crucial topic head-on, exploring both the complexities and limitations of an ethnocentric analytical lens. The collection challenges conventional wisdom regarding a particularly relevant demographic group, young people who will shape national politics in the coming decades and whose commitment to nationalistic principles has come under increased empirical scrutiny. This is essential reading for anyone interested in the legacy of ethnic conflict in the Balkans and its implications for the future of the European project. And I would add it's really timely, especially considering the context and the events, recent events also in this country, which have bring the youth to the fore of democratic processes. So please join me in welcoming our panelists. And I don't know who is going to be the first one to speak. Tamara, okay. So Tamara Pavasovic-Drozd is assistant professor at the Faculty of Economics of the University of Ljubljana. She holds an MA in political science from Syracuse University and a PhD in sociology from Harvard. She has published widely on ethnic dynamics, stereotypes, identity, collective memory, and related topics. And let's welcome our panelists.
Okay, and the screen will magically appear. Okay, so while it's opening, I'm going to spend a few minutes first talking about why we decided in a cafe in Belgrade on a napkin to draft the idea for this project. And then I'll spend a little bit of time talking about my research or my contribution to the volume. So we start off with these assumptions that we've seen in a lot of the literature on the area, which is that this new generation is problematic and more nationalistic than the previous ones. You see this in tabloids and newspapers. Youth are less tolerant. We see this emphasis on neo-Nazis and problematic youth groups. And this idea that youth need to distance themselves from excessive identifications and that these ethnic identifications are actually trumping everything else that's going on in their lives. And when I did my PhD 5 years ago, I actually found that class issues and economic concerns are actually huge in the lives of young people. And we saw this in Bosnia a few years ago with the movement We're Hungry in All Three Languages, right? So you're saying it doesn't matter which ethnic group you belong to, these socioeconomic concerns are more important. And another of the assumption is that what is holding the region back are these ethno-nationalistic orientations. So that's what we took as a starting point, and then decided to really say, okay, the youth that we're talking about from 2000 are very, very different than youth today. And even as a professor at the University of Ljubljana, I see a lot of Serbian, Macedonian, Kosovar students in Ljubljana through Erasmus exchange programs, and you see the differences in the ways these youth who now live under most of the countries are apart from Bosnia and Kosovo, but no visa requirements anymore, right? So visa requirements have been softened. So now youth are traveling much more than the previous generation. LGBT movements, globalization, Facebook, we don't even have to go into all of the new things these youth are facing. And because of this, identities have become much more complicated. And one of the arguments that I also tried to make in my dissertation has been that we cannot study these youth in the same way that we have studied youth before. So the two aims of the book have been first, theoretically, to transcend this and actually say, what are youth doing on the ground? So what does it mean to be Serbian or Croatian or Bosniak to actual youth? So not assume what they feel, not give them a survey saying, do you feel European first? Do you feel Croatian first? Or rank your identities, but to actually go see how does this work on the ground. So focus more on identification as opposed to check your identity. And we wanted to look at these cleavages, young versus old, educated, non-educated, politicized, non-politicized, urban, rural. Also in Bosnia, a huge percentage of the population has dual citizenship, and these youth are coming back and forth. So we have these fluid identities. So how is this impacting dynamics? And then the cleavages within these groups. And then empirically, the reason why we sell this theoretical idea, but empirically it's really difficult because you actually have to go talk to them, right? And it's much easier to just have a survey. What we wanted was when we were looking for volumes, people who were for contributions to the volume, people who are explicitly working on the ground. And this is people who go and they study and they do focus groups or they do classroom observation. They're actually spending time with youth instead of just giving them a survey or check boxes to fill. So this is empirical identification, is to trying to figure out how to actually measure ethnic identity and values in a way that actually fit the way that youth are identifying. So that's kind of the background of the whole volume. So my own contribution is ethnographic data on Serbia and Croatia. So I did about 160 in-depth interviews in Belgrade and Zagreb. And usually these kinds of studies happen as a part of a dissertation or these single case study, really in-depth studies. So in addition to this, I also watched how youth are taught about history in the classroom, what kind of questions they ask. And in focus groups, because of course youth are very different when they talk in front of their peers versus when you interview them one-on-one, because you get completely different responses. So I'll just run very quickly through 2 or 3 of the main findings. And the first one was the need for positive non-ethnic bases of national pride. So when I would ask youth, let's say, tell me a time when you saw something on TV that made you proud to be Serbian, or can you think of a time when you felt pride in your country? And it was really, really difficult for youth to come up with anything other than Novak Djokovic and tennis and sports. Or to say, well, to me, be Serbian, it means to celebrate a slava, and then go into these traditional kind of cliche explanations. Whereas Croatian youth were really able to say, oh, we have a beautiful seaside, we're proud of the fresh air and the Adriatic Sea. And as we'll see in a second, this actually comes from messages they get in the textbooks and in the media. So it just shows this need for positive bases of national pride that are not just about your ethnic group in a traditional sense. So for Croatian youth, I saw a lot of students say things like, we have lots of minerals and natural riches, beaches, forests, beautiful seas. So this came up a lot. You could see that this pride in the natural environment was a really big part of their feeling of national identification with Croatia. Whereas in Serbia, it was really, really difficult. People talked about being Orthodox, or they would talk about Kosovo, but when you would really try to draw out from them what this means, it was more difficult. So celebrate the Sava, be Orthodox, and so on. And I'm not saying that Serbian youth actually really, and really authentically feel this. It's just when you force them to say what you feel proud of, it's easier for them to jump to these cliches. And then the external perception of the ethnic group was also really important. Both of the youth were really, really preoccupied with what did other people think. So they would start off with, instead of I think what it means to be Serbian is X, they would say other people think this is what we are like, and their identification is always in dialogue with how they think others perceive them. So again, sports successes came up in both countries. In Croatia, it was very much distinguishing Croatia from being Balkan or being uncivilized. But again, this comes also from the textbooks and the media, which I'll show in a second. In Serbia, there was a lot of resentment among youth, especially progressive youth, that the West still perceived them as being backwards. So one of the girls said she doesn't feel a sense of belonging. And she says she could also ask the Germans, do you identify with Nazis in the same way people expect her to identify with these Serbian nationalist sentiments with which she does not identify with. And this really relates to the work that Cynthia Miller-Idris does with post youth in Germany right now, and how angry they are about carrying this burden of what their parents and grandparents did, and how this actually acts as an impetus for radicalization later because of the anger youth feel about being stereotyped in this particular way. And this is one of the pictures I was alluding to from a geography textbook in Croatia, where you can actually see, so you have, this is fancy. So Middle Europe, the Mediterranean, and Southeast Europe, and here you see a church and a mosque, whereas the Western Europe is civilized, and you see a big city and a Catholic church. And these lessons in the textbooks are called Croatia at the context of 3 cultural civilizational circles, right? So it explicitly talks about that there are 3 civilizations. Croatia, but you might notice, is actually not even touching the bottom one, right? It's barely catching them. And it says, despite Croatia being at the touch of these 3 circles, we identify Croatia as firmly middle Central European, right? So this is, of course, the way in which the elites or the textbooks are trying to teach Croatian students in what ways should you identify as Croatian, and framing it is in a civilizational kind of context, which of course then you see in children's narratives because they pick up on the narratives coming from here. And then the last finding is that Serbian youth, as opposed to Croatian youth, were much, if you ask them what they were proud of, they couldn't find this present pride, right? So the best period was the Nemanjić dynasty, which is 12th and 13th century. And you really don't find Serbs that are proud. Okay, I wouldn't expect them to be proud of the 1990s, but there are very few youth who actually are proud of their country today or think it's a good period. Whereas when we look at Croatian youth, most Croatian youth actually find independent Croatia as the best the best period of history. So you see how I notice how this motive of history really kind of weaves through their narratives of how they understand being Croatian today. And then the last thing I want to mention is socioeconomic differences. If you look here, this is mean agreement. It's a survey, which I just shunned, but surveys do show us these remarkable differences. And this is 1 is strongly disagree, 5 is strongly agree. So the higher the score, the more tolerant. And you actually see not only are boys always less tolerant than girls, but this holds across the globe in most social science surveys. But also when you look at college track versus 4-year vocational versus 3-year vocational, the tolerance level falls. It drops with each step. And this is from the EU to should Croatia be just for Croats to being married to somebody else. This is, of course, it falls. The tolerance level falls in each socioeconomic class. So this shows you that already in high school, which is the students that I interviewed, students have these firm attitudes and firm opinions, and they vary significantly based on socioeconomic class. So here's just a summary of the things that I just talked about today. So again, it was about 2 years of ethnographic research, and the argument is that only by studying and talking to these youth, you can really understand how they operate. And the other contributions to the volume all similarly dealt with youth in their particular context and trying to really figure out how does ethnicity work on the ground what matters to youth. And that's why actually the volume is called Changing Youth Values and not Changing Youth Identities, to show that actually we shouldn't start off with assuming that ethnic identity is the primary thing that matters, but that these other values could be more important. Thank you.
Can I stay here? Mine is much more simple. I had kind of two quick. What did you?
Sure, I will just introduce you. So our second speaker today is Danilo Mandic, who is a postdoctoral college fellow and lecturer in the Harvard Sociology Department. He holds a BA from Princeton and PhD from Harvard, both in sociology, and is currently working on a book about separatist movements for Princeton University Press. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So I had to follow up mostly on Tamara's and Aida's introduction. Two quick points. One is about this kind of ideological barrier across societies like Serbia and Kosovo, Serbia and Croatia, other comparative attempts in the book. And I'd like to underscore how big of a chasm that barrier is. And then hopefully just quickly something about the transmission of memory across generations, this kind of intergenerational transmission of memory. On the barrier, as Tamara mentioned, the truth is that this book, like many masterpieces, emerged out of a frustration that we shared. And the frustration was that time after time in scholarly and popular press and other venues, we did see this cliche of a kind of go-to, kind of a priori template for how do you study young people in Southeast Europe ethno-nationally. And a particular thesis within that, a more specific one, which is these people are more nationalistic than their parents. Look at this chauvinism, look at the jingoism, look at this paradox of how this post-war generation that doesn't even remember the wars of the Yugoslav civil wars and so on are more bigoted and so on. And this was often a kind of, it produced a number of blind spots. And it also gave a kind of a ritualistic, really cliche, as Tamara said, that when somebody wanted to write something on youth in Southeast Europe, you had a kind of mandatory opening paragraph which warned, particularly the English-speaking reader, that be careful, you're entering into this heart of darkness where young people are raving nationalistic, anti-European, and on it goes. And this became like sort of saying grace before a Catholic meal. You have to say grace, and before you say something about Southeast Europe, you have to have this thesis. So we tried, largely unsuccessfully, to undermine this, and one of the ways was, I'll talk mostly about Kosovo, which was an obsession of mine for many years, and it's emotional for me even to think about now these interviews that we were doing because of this chasm between the two societies. Between the war period and the Declaration of Independence, so between, say, June, the bombing ended June 1999, up until February 2008, when the Declaration of Independence happened, it was tremendously difficult to even take this. It was an act of real courage and a leap of faith for my Kosovar colleagues to come to Belgrade and do some multi-culti workshops on how do we just get in a room together to discuss what the hell, who are we even talking about? So you had a real elaborate nationalist mythology and prejudice and cultural stereotype doesn't even begin to describe it. I try sometimes for my American colleagues to think of an analogy. It's as if somebody says, I'm going to go meet a bunch of white supremacists or something. Automatically you're suspicious or so, like why? What is there to talk about? And now imagine a whole society which attacked us and so on of white supremacists. And then here you are trying to bring. So just to illustrate it, I went there first for 2004. The bus ride was 10, 15 hours, I forget now. And sometimes you would stand on the bus, the Belgrade to Pristina bus. And everybody, the first striking thing I noticed, everybody was dead silent. This was 2004, 5 years after the war, which sounds like a long time, but is no time at all. And people were dead silent because I learned later there's a kind of informal rule on these buses that nobody dare speak to anybody. Because if you open your mouth, you can reveal who's Serbian and who's Albanian. So people were sitting for 15 hours on this bus, sometimes standing because there isn't enough room, and even with their traveling companions, not even whispering for fear of being revealed. And then this delicate political moment of they can tell who you are based on which stop you come off of. Is it an Albanian village? Is it a Serbian village? And then we arrived one night at just to illustrate the complexity, And the guy came to pick us up. There was Bechar, a colleague of mine who was brave enough or crazy enough, as it may be, to participate in this, would pick us up, and he risked, to make a long story short, he risked really physical injury for hosting us, for having us brought there. And in front of our eyes, like I'm talking physical, he could have really been beaten physically. I'm not talking symbolic aggression injury. It's like he really took this risk. And he also had to go against his own family, which had losses in the 98 in Kosovo, to tell them, now I'm bringing a busload of Serbs into Pristina. It was no joke. And he would proceed after this to say all sorts of terrible things to us. Racist things, chauvinist things, shkije this, shkije that, which is the derogatory term for Serb. The whole discourse back then was shqiptari shkije, which is the derogatory terms for the Serbian and Albanian sides. And it didn't used to be derogatory in the original context before the 80s, but it became, of course, derogatory through the wars and particularly the late 90s, and today is considered, thankfully, politically incorrect. And in polite company, you won't hear it. But back then, this guy said, if you were to transcribe an interview with him, he helped me find some of the people in my chapter later on. But back then, if you were to transcribe an interview with him, it would be full of utter nationalist venom, ethno-nationalist venom, right? You Serbs are this, that you killed you people are all the same, you're all right. And of course, vice versa in Serbia, analogously too. But then I remember having this tremendous revelation where, wait a second, this same guy who's giving us these lectures about how you are all aggressors, you all deserve to be driven into the, whatever, on and on and on. This same guy risked his personal safety, like directly. He didn't have to do any of that to get us just physically to go from Belgrade to Pristina. And then we returned the favor where I got a call one morning at 6 a.m. when his delegation of 4 or 5 young people in their early 20s wanted to come to Belgrade for the first time, were detained not put in jail, but in a pritvor, detention thing, even though we had all the documents from the Ministry of Interior and all the rest of it. And I get a call at 6 a.m. to say, my God, do you know that we've been detained? Then I go and some unpleasant guy with a mustache is lecturing me on treason. It was treason. So the very thought of crossing this barrier was a thought crime. And the physical act of it was very... So that's just the first point. It sounds banal or trivial, but I can't emphasize enough how, to this day, it remains in a lower intensity form. But just this general notion that you have an entire generation of young people. It doesn't help matters that everybody over 35 in Kosovo today doesn't speak Serbian anymore. Everybody under 35, of course, doesn't speak Serbian anymore. Everybody over 35 does, so you have an additional little bit, 1,000 things like that. And you have an elaborate stereotype thing which is perpetuated through this barrier without anybody having visited, without anybody having crossed it, without anybody, everything about I was reminded of an anecdote about a KGB scholar who was who was head of the division for Amerikanistika, which was the American thing, right? And this guy was a legend because he produced over a career of 30, 40 years, a whole set of scholarships about America. And most of it was pure Soviet propaganda, but then a small portion of it was very good about American demography, racial relations, and so on. I forget his name. So he produced enormously this whole corpus of work on America. And somebody once asked him, well, have you ever been to the United States? And he replied memorably, God forbid, I wouldn't want it to influence my opinion. And so there's a lot of that in Southeast Europe. You have elaborate folk sociology on behalf of the Serbs about the Kosovar Albanian youth, what they're like, why they hate us, how homogenous they are, what their culture is, why they're so tight where we are so divided, how we are so altruistic and they are so aggressive and xenophobic and so on, proceeding without any reference to meeting actual human beings in the flesh. And so lo and behold, you find when you cross this barrier, and this is a major theme of the book, that the ethno-national lens is of course there, but it's not there alone. And it's not there in the way you imagined it, of course, not having, because very quickly you find something like youth solidarity, which is a clumsy term that I tried to push in this chapter, and we can maybe think of a better way to conceptualize it, but just the general idea that the extent to which they enact ethno-national categories, the extent to which they enact national identities, the extent to which they construct these symbolic boundaries, exclusionary boundaries, all of that stuff is one piece of the puzzle. And simultaneously coexisting with that, like this guy who is risking his safety at the same time as he's giving us nationalist lectures, at the same time, simultaneously, there exists tremendous solidarity through it's us young people. It's the socioeconomic solidarity. It's the class solidarity. It's the kind of, we share the same media. We share this. This is a new generation. This is different. And our parents are these old geezers who ruined everything. And this is a very important moment that we miss in that blind spot. And the second point about this leading into that, the intergenerational transmission of memory, I'm just struck by, if you compare, this isn't in the book, but this is maybe an important project that would come out of this book, as a further research agenda, which is, if you compare the kind of painting with a broad brush, but if you compare the narratives that parents transmit to children and those children to their children across, for example, the World War II generation, and then if you look at the people born in the 50s, 60s, 70s, the narrative they were told is often one of, we gave you everything. We gave independence to Yugoslavia. We defeated Hitler. And then we said no to Stalin. And we gave you free education. And we gave you free health care. And we gave you a red passport with which you can travel around, the envy of Europe. And we gave you a country that gives you a kind of very nice middle-class existence, often without the proper economic basis for it. But nevertheless, apartments could be gotten, employment could certainly be gotten, five-month vacations could certainly be gotten, and all the rest of it. And then if you compare their children of the subsequent decades, kind of late 70s, 80s, 90s, and then into the 2000s, what do they hear from their inheritance, as it were? We gave you 4 wars, we gave you 100,000 dead, we gave you millions of refugees, these hundreds of thousands of displaced, hundreds of thousands of refugees and millions of displaced. A lot of new borders for people to cross to become refugees in that context. We gave you total unemployment. We gave you a situation where we review in the introduction a new demographic reality where people postpone childbirth, people postpone moving out of their parents' house. People are not crazy enough to have children in such economic conditions. Unemployment, I don't have to tell you about. We gave you the biggest brain drain in the European Union, right? Very different narrative. And I wonder how, especially because of the demographic reality, one of its features is that Southeast European youth overwhelmingly live more with grandparents than, you have to go far and wide with, say, my generation Americans at Harvard who lived with their grandparents and who had grandparents as babysitters instead of babysitters, or maids even sometimes. So here, these grandparents are there, and they tell stories. They function as babysitters for many of these young people, and they tell stories. They tell stories about their war experience. They tell stories that kind of, but at the same time, these young people are not absorbing this as passive sponges. They are taking this, interpreting it, reinterpreting it, and rejecting much of it, so that, and I'll end with this thought, that along the lines of the Sidris Miller argument, between the ethno-national superficial stuff that is sure as you're born easy to find, if you give a grant to the Harvard undergraduate to go find you how nationalistic and xenophobic they are, he can easily do that by misapplying some superficial ethnic distance thing or doing the Eurobarometer thing. Of course, but that's trivial. The bigger trick is to do some kind of in-depth scratching beneath that surface to see how that is enacted conditionally, partially, and simultaneously with things that contradict it, like the youth solidarity, like the class solidarity, like a whole bunch of other things. And so one of the things that came there after the fact that I didn't notice on time is a tremendous resentment towards the parents, towards how everyone I love my mother, I love my father, and of course that's there. But also there's a sense of we are paying the price for you having wrecked these countries. You lived a nice kind of Titoist utopia, which was a very pleasant dream, and now you left us with the sobering nightmare at the end of it. And that exists across the ethnic divide, even in Serbia and Kosovo, which are arguably the most divided culturally and in every other way. That brings people together, and you see constantly in the interviews, there's a kind of, in my experience at least, there's a kind of mandatory 15 minutes of cathartic spitting the nationalist venom, but then they proceed to tell you the human actual reality of their of their feelings and their thoughts and so on, which are often very similar and lead to this shock, like, my God, your attitude towards your parents' generation is exactly like mine. They often use even the same words to describe them. So that's that call really for how can we think more about that intergenerational transmission of memory and how it worked given the tremendously different contexts. Thank you so much for being here as well.
And we have two discussants today with us. Mary Waters is the John L. Lowe Professor of Sociology at Harvard. She's one of the world's leading migration scholars, having authored classic works on immigrant integration, children of immigrants, and ethnic and racial identity in the U.S. A beloved teacher and mentor, Professor Waters has just recently been appointed as the first ever PVK Professor of Arts and Sciences. And I need to explain that this is the highest honor recognizing scholarly achievements at the Faculty of Arts and Sciences at Harvard. So I think that deserves a round of applause.
And she was both of our dissertation.
And I'll also introduce our second discussant, Vladimir Petrovic, who is a senior academic researcher at Boston University's Pardee School of Global Studies. Trained as a historian, he has worked in the legal field at the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia and the Serbian War Crimes Prosecutor's Office. He is the author of 5 books and has published extensively on Yugoslav history and post-war reconciliation. So the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to be here, and it was a pleasure to be an early reader of the book. Actually, the pleasure is significantly diminished now because talking after the 2 authors is a bit like being a DJ at the after party, if I'm allowed, with this youthful metaphor. I was asked by both Tamara and Danilo to try to look at the book with a critical eye and to try to come up
Not
with...
too critical.
with a somewhat critical eye, and to try to come up with some points for discussion. And of course, I came up with many. I thought it was difficult to be way too critical. I thought I should focus on something which is considered, to my mind, to be a lasting contribution by this volume. And actually, my contribution will come in 3 tiers. I think we might talk about this book from the point of view of its topic, from the point of view of its theoretical approach, and from the point of view of its methodology. So this is what I'm going to try to do in about 10 minutes. Pardon me in advance if what I have to say is somewhat peppered with my personal experiences, because just as 2 of these guys, I also come from the Balkans. I was just as frustrated as they were with the situation in my country and the neighboring countries, and also I intermingled this frustration with my professional life very much so. Unlike the 2 of them, I went in a slightly different direction, in the direction of investigation and prosecution of war crimes. But as you will see, these topics are in curious ways quite intertwined. So, let me start with the topic, youth. I think it's a somewhat misunderstood concept in the Balkans, in Eastern Europe, and elsewhere as well. In particular in the post-communist context, because in the post-communist context, quite abruptly, youth came from a situation A, before 1989, when youth was not only idealized, but also idolized. It was pretty much central for the communist discourse. It was all about the youth. We are generating the new youth. We are gently guiding the new youth into the new future, and so on and so forth. And then overnight, this youth simply disappeared. From being a central feature of the discourse, it became completely marginalized. Marginalized, neglected, and even worse so, somehow taken for granted. Everybody knew that the youth still exists. People talked about it, politicians still capitalize on youth. If you don't know what to say, you mention mothers, children, protection, and so on and so forth. And indeed, the book opens exactly with that anecdote, with the trans-Balkan conversation of a couple of politicians about how to improve the life of their youth. But if you give it a critical reading, you see that they have no clue what they're talking about. And the first contribution of this book is to re-thematize this topic. Okay, it's not enough to say the youth. Let us see what are we talking about, which kind of youth, which generations, and what do they actually do. It's extremely important, and I saw it actually in my professional life. You are, of course, quite well aware of the fact that prosecuting war crimes is a sort of a difficult, against the current type of a job. And some sort of consolation of people who do it is, goes along the following lines. Well, okay, our contemporaries really don't like what we do and so on and so forth. They had been too implicated in these events anyhow, and we can't expect them to reflect on these things the way we want them to. However, should we do something in this direction, at least this new generation which comes afterwards is going to wake up, like Germany, ask their parents, what did you do, and so on and so forth. There will be this generational change and shift, and so on. Okay. In the case of the Balkans, couple of public opinion polls, some of them commissioned by the offices I was working in, showed us black and white how wrong we were. No, this new generation stepped into the fore. They never asked their parents questions we meant they should ask their parents, and the statistics was bad. It showed us that the youth doesn't know and doesn't care. My colleagues went rogue, some of them they turned to drinking, some of them just resigned, and so on. I decided to supplement those public opinion polls with a couple of focus groups. So I started talking to students in high school groups in the Balkans, mostly in Belgrade, but also in Croatia, and I came up with an interesting conclusion from these focus groups. True, they don't know, but not true. It's not true that they don't care. It's just that our myopic vision, or my myopic vision, that like war crimes are alpha and omega of everything, sort of misguided me. I failed to understand that without some comprehensive political education, without understanding of so many vectors that kids are influenced by, family, peers, schooling, media, and so on and so forth, it's extremely ambitious to expect that they would just wake up one day and say, oh, Daddy, what did you do during the war? So basically, this is how I understood that the things are quite complicated, and I'm so glad that the Trost Mandic volume is definitely now proving me so. So now I will always carry the book with me to tell to other people what is it actually all about and how complicated life actually can be. That leads me to framing. The subtitle of this book, and its subtitle, Beyond Ethnicity, is tremendously important. Ethnicity was a central focus, as was told before, and I don't need to repeat it, whenever anybody encounters any book regarding the Balkan studies. But not only ethnicity, it was a rather unhealthy binary of dichotomy between ethnic and civic. Ethnic-civic, civic-ethnic, ethnic-civic. Again, in my job, the whole idea, underlining Fukuyamian type of a thing, was that should we somehow reach out to people, convert their ethno-nationalistic thinking into wider universalist global civic commitment, everything falls into place. This was the assumption. And time and again, we were proven wrong by events. But you know how it is with the prejudice. It takes really a while, and it takes not one wall, but a couple of walls to understand after a while that something is wrong, or at least something is more complex than we thought. I think the book sort of gives us a persuasive argument that it's much more complex issue, and it's definitely not about converting ethnic identity into a civic identity. Actually, chapter number 8 has a fascinating sort of study. The chapter is called Taming Conflicting Identities, Searching for New Youth Values in the Western Balkans. Tellingly, it's authored by 4 people, and it came up with a whole hierarchy of values of the youth across the Balkans. And I will just read out this hierarchy of entities, of institutions which are important for youth. So, in this order: family, friends, country, town, religion, ethnicity, gender, Balkans, Europe. For me, quite a surprising hierarchy. I didn't expect this order of appearance. It begs for a conversation and it begs for a discussion. I will leave this discussion to you, but I will pose a couple of questions along those lines. So the first question I would actually pose to the authors is, okay, I'm completely convinced we should go beyond ethnicity. Cool. But where do we go? How do we reframe in any constructing way this inconsistent maze of chaos? How do we produce anything out of it which is helpful but not paternalistic when it comes to giving advices to the youth, and to the policymakers? So this is the first question. Because my fear is, it's easy to say, well, we should go beyond ethnicity, but one shouldn't underestimate that nationalism is highly contextual. Let me give you a historical example. Social unrest in Yugoslavia in 1990, as we now know well from a book by a colleague called Rory Archer, was rather social discontent. People were quitting their jobs or going out at the street. They demanded bread and this and that. But it took only a couple of months, couple of democratic elections for this discontent to be hijacked by a nationalist political elite overnight, right? So I would just kind of ask you then, okay, so what is it about ethnicity that, like you, as a Balkan proverb says, you throw it out through the door and then it creeps out through the window? That's the first question. The third issue I wanted to raise, a part of the topic and the framing, which were extremely commendable, is methodology. And this is indeed a lasting contribution. Southeast European studies are a mess. They are a chaos from all sorts of points of view. It's not only political turfs and whims and so on and so forth. It's some of the problems are linguistical and logistical as well. In order to be a persuasive Balkan scholar, you need to speak Serbo-Croatian, Slovenian, Greek. Somebody is always going to ask you, aha, but you don't speak Turkish, and so on and so forth, plus a couple of major European languages so that you can actually relay what you found out. It's not realistic. It's a peripheral field, it's a periphery of Europe, therefore there is no money for sustained institutional research of these things. They are shrinking all over the world. So how do you go about it? Well, mostly by creating committed teams of people, right? And it seems to me that this is exactly what this project succeeded to do, to combine people who roll on optimism and who roll on enthusiasm, which is, I think, in contemporary academia, well, I don't know. I wish I could see more of it. So that's I think highly commendable. So I hope that the book travels with Tamara tomorrow to New York to World Convention of Association for Study of Nationalities, because I really think it can be showcased as a successful example of trans-Balkan cooperation. However, if it does, Tamara, and I don't know if it does, I can preempt a couple of questions. I'm sure that colleagues from the Balkan Studies would ask, why is Croatia in? Why is Slovenia out? What about Greece? What about Turkey? And so on and so forth, which says a lot about how fluid this region is. And the question then is, how did you define Southeast Europe? How did you correlate it with Western Balkans and the whole luggage and baggage which goes with that? Connected question is, in your view, how generalizable your conclusions are? Is there anything specific for Southeast European youth which can be said for, let's say, Central and Eastern European youth, or Eastern European youth, or European youth, or global youth in general? So this is, I think, sort of a question which I would like to pose, because it also leads me to a sort of a conclusion. And actually, I want to preempt another question, the dreaded so what question of US academia, or who cares, and so on and so forth. I think there are so many reasons to care. And I'm not happy to share these reasons with you. If I take you back to 1991 or 2 or 3, the situation as it revolved in the former Yugoslavia or in Rwanda or in Nagorno-Karabakh was thought to be a sort of an incident, some sort of last gasp of the 20th century, right? An incident here, an incident there, but ultimately we are moving in some other direction. Sadly, now we know better, and it seems that it was rather some sort of a first wound of the 21st century, right? In that respect, I think some lessons need to be learned or could be learned from these situations, which are extremely generalizable and much more relevant than I would care them to be. So on that uplifting note, I think it's time for me to stop and to thank you again for the invitation.
Thank you.
Well, I am extremely honored to be invited to talk about this wonderful book, and in no small part because I am not at all an expert on the Balkans, and everything I know about it comes from these two terrific scholars who I had the pleasure to work with as they did their dissertations. And the extent to which my knowledge of this whole world is minimal. I'll tell you a story. So I am an expert, such as I am, of ethnicity. And my first book, which was my dissertation, I did the field work in the early 1980s, or mid-1980s, actually, published the book in 1990. It was called Ethnic Options. And it was about how later generation Americans who had immigrants in their grandparents or great-grandparents, how they thought about their ethnicity, how they identified with their ethnicity. And I did one interview, and the woman told me, well, yes, we've discovered that we have Yugoslavian ancestors. So now we have figured out how to cook Yugoslavian food, and we've gotten Yugoslavian costumes for the kid, and we want to go to Yugoslavian fairs and stuff. She was living in the Bay Area, in Silicon Valley, actually. And she said, we want to find other Yugoslavian people because, and this was somebody who was, great-great-grandparent. And so I wrote it all down. I went back to my advisor and I said, yes, now I have a Yugoslavian. I can check that off. I have a lot of Italians. And he was like, what? Well, what were they really? They're not Yugoslavian. They're something else. I was like, oh, I never asked that part. I just wrote it all down, and that was their ethnicity. And, the whole point of the book was that people were inventing they found something in their ancestry, and then they were kind of inventing a way to be that way. And recently I kind of returned to this topic and wrote a brief thing in which I was thinking about when people now can do DNA tests and they discover that they have a new ancestry. And of course, now it comes back and it tells you maybe you have like 1 or 2% Neanderthal, right? And I assume, and now everybody's going to be going out and getting barbecue sets, right? Because they're Neanderthal and they have to express their Neanderthal ethnicity. So, in that way, my approach to ethnicity was very much this, assumption that it was, especially for white Americans, that the ethnicity was something which was enjoyable and voluntary. And then when I started working with Tamara, and she went out into the field, and she came back with, she had done the Bogardus distance scale. And she said, well, Mary, it starts with the closest is you would marry them or have them in your family, and the furthest away was I would bar them from my country. And you had these young junior high kids, and they were crossing that out and said, I would kill them, right, when you asked about somebody from a different ethnic group. And I think I've thought about that actually in the past year or so, as our country has become more partisan, and as the kind of white supremacy and the nationalism has really become mobilized around our own disagreements. And I think to myself, I would want to kill a few of these people I'm watching on television too. I have this horrible hatred, really, that somehow has been mobilized in a way that I am aware of, but don't really understand completely how this has happened so rapidly. And I think that the work that you both did for your dissertations and your earlier work on ethnicity in this area, and then the task, shows really the depths, and the stories that Danilo just told tells the depths of these cleavages that were organized around ethnicity. And then I think taking the point of the book, which was to step back and say, how, where, and when does ethnic and national identification processes become salient? That was a really great step to say, we can't assume it, but it does matter. And the question is when and how and where and for what people. And so I think that this book is really, it shows the real range among young people in this area, from it mattering an incredible amount to it really not being salient for some young people for whom a European and a much more cosmopolitan identity and value is much more important. One of the more heartbreaking chapters in the book is interviews with young people who are the children of the wartime rapes that happened. And one young teenager says, I have Serbian blood, and in this way I am available for everyone to hate me. I am a channel for their sadness. I am guilty for their pain. I am guilty for their misery that lives on, and no one likes me, everyone avoids me, everyone hates me. So the early debates in academia about primordial versus chosen ethnicities, I mean, this this young person is told that her blood is responsible for this hatred, and other young kids also discuss being beaten, having no friends. They describe themselves as a cancer, right? So this is unbelievably salient for them, right? And the author tries to go on to say, in some ways they try to rise above this, but this is unbelievably salient. At the same time, we find young people for whom there is this transcendence of the past cleavages. And so I think the thinking about the questions that this great book raises with this these findings is that we need better ways of understanding how this ethnicity gets mobilized or demobilized and how nationalism feeds off of these distinctions. And I think you are right that the problem, and I think you frame it in the book as the problem is when you study youth, you can't use surveys. And the surveys work for older people, but they don't work for the younger people. I don't think that's true. I don't think they work for the older people so much either. I think that we need to find other ways, and the interviews and some other ways in which we can get the expression of these values and identities and this process of identification, not a static identity, but how it changes over time. And that, I think you need very in-depth qualitative research of the type that this book is a true exemplar of. I think that one of the questions that came for me is the question of what determines these cleavages. And I think socioeconomic status is very clearly one of them. I wondered about the urban-rural divide and whether that was an important one. I didn't see as much on that as maybe would have been useful. And then I thought a lot about this idea of the use of history and how history is there to be mobilized or not by leaders, by the media, by politicians, and that it's latent, but it can be put into use. And I think more studies which try to understand how that history is made salient or can be repackaged, I think, is another step to go forward. I think that, and I'm really picking up here on the point that Vladimir made, which is that we did think that that there was these kind of hot spots of nationalism that were happening, and especially being an American, thinking that this was not going to happen here, and the kind of terror of this past year. And the deep worry that comes from seeing, our politicians being captured by this white nationalism, which is what we're living with right now. I think that the question of whether youth are susceptible to these, right now, I think it's happening in the U.S. because people who are older are being mobilized. But whether youth are susceptible and what it is, and I think this question that you really pinpointed, which I have found also in my research in the U.S. and other researchers have found it throughout Western Europe as well, the elongation of the transition to adulthood. For various reasons, people are longer in this period between when they are kind of grown up but not yet fully adults. And whether that is an area in which people can be mobilized for political purposes, I think is another real part of what you've put your finger on that researchers should go forward. So I just want to end by recommending this book, hoping that everybody gets it and that you assign it in your classes, and we really all learn from it because it's really a terrific contribution to the scholarly literature.
Get some questions first.
However you feel.
Maybe get some questions.
Well, this was really a wonderful presentation. Thank you guys so much. And really interesting to dig into some of the questions here. And I really appreciated the comments and bringing it back to the U.S. context. And that actually made me think, Tamara had mentioned this, the sort of the economics, socioeconomics, as being one of the core, potentially, inflamers of this additional nationalism. And I am curious, in your research, did you find poverty and unemployment to be an important trigger to sort of stirring up that sense? Because if you look at, we lived well during, those Yugoslavia, and we had everything that we need, and we had the sense of, you're not wanting for more. And so if you look and compare, for example, Slovenia, that has a very high sort of living standard comparatively, but where there's also pockets of nationalism, versus Croatia and the sense of, yes, I mean, I think through the, through books, they definitely, and I'm sure through more of the things that you've seen, they absolutely emphasize and celebrate the things that are there to be proud of. But when you look at, the United States and how we're mobilizing and, the sense of we the forgotten, the whites that are unemployed, these, traditionally like labor jobs, if you start thinking about mobilization of nationalism, through the lens of poverty, I wonder if in your research you saw that as a key factor in whether one day we might dream that if the living standard is increased, that some of these things will dissipate, or whether you're more skeptical of that.
I was wondering, throughout your research and the times you've interviewed the kids, and have you actually developed maybe some kind of an idea of what the future holds for those kids in store, given the fact that our politicians are using the nationalistic propaganda to rally around rally their voters and get people to be part of their parties so they can get jobs, et cetera, on one hand, and on the other, still having that brain drain, from Serbia, because I'm Serbian, so I know a little bit about that brain drain, but on the other side, my mom's Croatian, so I hear that Croatians are also leaving Croatia for maybe economic reasons, and now having the ability to actually work in Europe much easier and to move around. How much is that? Do you have an opinion on it? And then the second question maybe about the surveys and how much they don't work, and given all the Cambridge Analytica ideas that they had, which maybe helped the sway, but at least to understand the profile of some of these kids through maybe social media, and if you have the ability or maybe looked into those avenues to figure out what really those kids have in mind. Because I have, again, many friends on Facebook. I don't really actively go on it, but sometimes I do when I want to message some of my friends. And then I realize that some of my friends from high school are posting these nationalistic invitations to some groups, whether it's extremely orthodox or, for Putin or for whoever else. So there might be, again, maybe something there to figure out where they really stand, as far as.
It's interesting that in terms of sources of national pride, things like landscape came up a lot, and I was curious whether other sources like arts and science, achievements in the arts and sciences were relevant, like artists, writers, inventors, that kind of thing.
That this point, just answering questions.
It's just too much, but I'll try. So, in reverse order, the arts, as I'm glad you mentioned, in my own interviews on the Kosovo thing, they were not a dominant, but they certainly came up, cultural symbols, songs, music, and so on. And I remember one respondent, it's in the chapter, who found it ridiculous that now again, here's a language barrier, here's the biggest barrier you'll find of any paired cases in the Balkans. And they found it absurd that somebody is referring to this as Albanian music versus Serbian music, and how wonderful it is that we can listen to it together and so on. It's a very clear example of, it's not necessarily all that these cultural artifacts or whatever, they can be music was most prominent in my thing, they can be films. I think somebody was talking about Kusturica here, and also in a kind of anti-nationalist way, a deliberately anti-nationalist way. Certainly it can be used to reinforce, to reify the boundaries, the ethno-national ones, but for sure it can be, if someone wants to, time and again, even in the course of a single interview, you see constant usage of these cultural artifacts to say, here's the ethno-national divide, and let me show you how it's ridiculous. Using on the social media, or the role of what's new about the new, so my own sense is that there's a kind of techno-fetishism that overemphasizes the role of social media and how that's what defines the young and that the Facebook revolution is always, it's kind of easy to emphasize it. It's easy to do coding of the hateful comments on YouTube. We review some of this in the introduction, where it's a very popular data source, first of all, and it's very popular as a kind of hand-waving to figure out something that we don't necessarily have very good empirical evidence on, but then you point your finger at the social media, whether it's for good developments or whether it's some of the chapters talk about certain political insurgencies that on the whole people like us would support, certainly, that are civic-minded, that are anti-corruption, for example, and underline the importance of the social media there. But in the bigger picture, my sense is that it's overemphasized, and that things like the demographic issue, things like the unemployment, the class, it's overwhelmingly more important. You have in Kosovo, to take the worst example, I mean, Bosnia Herzegovina, and depending how you divide it up, Kosovo is really the most, by liberal estimates, you have a 28% total unemployment, but then when you look at the youth, over 60%. By youth, we mean from like 18 to 35, right? And as you know, there's apropos the migration, 40,000 Kosovars have been repatriated from Germany, just from Germany, from 2014 until today, just dumped back. And that's 40,000 out of a presumed, we don't know, possibly 100, possibly 200,000 who, before the Middle Eastern migrants fled the Balkan route, came in early 2014, running away like mad. And this connects to the first question about the class. Yeah, I think absolutely. If Mary's important question, like what? So the real question, of course, is what undermines these cleavages and what sustains them. And we would like to say that class can do both. We would like to say that even at that methodological level of how do you approach the interview, if you come to them and say, I'm talking to you because you're a Kosovar Albanian,
Right.
well, that's it. And of course you're going to find what you came to find. Because what else could you have been looking for except the nationalism? What else is there to look for in the Balkans, right? But of course, I learned this late, having done the idiotic mistake of enacting that before even through the sampling even, you tell them why you're talking. But if you approach it as, I want to talk to you because you're a young person, and I'm doing a young person study, and I don't have to mention whether I'm doing a comparative between the Serb, you get a completely different conversation. And sometimes even within the same, as in-depth interviews are beautiful, because within the same 4 or 5 hours, you have tremendous variation into what the dominant value identification process is. And the class can work both ways there. But in my interviews, certainly one of the key aspects of the youth solidarity was precisely this recognition. And again, the kind of a deliberate undermining of the nationalism, which they are very aware of, and which they put here and then proceed to demolish in a variety of ways by enacting the thing like, look, isn't it ridiculous that our unemployment is the same as the unemployment there? Isn't it ridiculous that we are the leftover survivors of the brain drain? So one of the themes that really stood out was the brain drain is such not just the kind of the demographic reality of the numbers, but a cultural template through which people understand themselves as being young. What is your future plan when you grow up, for example? Can't be answered without reference to this idea that, well, I want to go to Germany, I want to go here, I want to go there. And then there's a layer of people who have managed that, who got out, who kind of survived, and we're stuck here, we're left over. and we're just sort of the leftovers who can't get out. And again, that's a tremendous resource, because time and again in the Kosovars and Serbs back then were enacting this constantly to say, look, we're in the same, u istom smo loncu, as the expression goes. So this, you can be Shqiptari and Shqiptari, but in this regard, we're in the same thing. So it can be, if a political party wanted to mobilize on the ethno-national bigotry and chauvinism, it's no surprise that they would be able to do this effortlessly. But if a political party wanted to mobilize on the generational divides, the age cohort, if whatever you want to call it, the idea that young people unite against the elders or the people who ruined the country, I'm serious, no, but politics you need an enemy. You can easily have mobilization on the grounds of class, on the grounds of age, on the grounds of generational grievances, not ethnic grievances.
Okay.
That was overdone. Sorry.
No, so I wanted to say, first of all, going back, is that really, I mean, it's called Changing Its Values Southeast Europe, but like you said, we started off with in the European periphery, and then it's the Western Balkans, and actually even just crafting the words for the book, we had issues. So somebody said Kosovo should be listed as a list of the countries, where other authors were like, should be Kosovo be listed, but then if Kosovo is, then Vojvodina should also be. And I know even in when I write, I always say Serbia and Croatia, and then I have to be cognizant, well, somebody might think I'm being Serbo-centric, so I make a point to always alphabetize the country, so I'll say Bosnia, so I'll do Bosnia, Croatia, or I'll randomize through the article that it says Croatia and Serbia, and all of these things that you have to be careful of, because you don't want to, and this goes back to also Rogers Brubaker, who really makes the most theoretically compelling arguments beyond ethnicity. And even he gave a talk, and once afterwards I said, but how do you actually, I mean, and even in his book, he says, we need to move beyond ethnic groups. This ethnic groupism doesn't work. And then through the rest of the volume, he starts going back to these ethnic groups. And the question is how, and I agree. We said, I think the introduction is compelling, and I don't think we do anything really to actually, because it really, you state the problem, but there's not much you can do without, going back to the same categories you started off criticizing. And we had the same thing. Are we going to spell Kosova or Kosovo? Who are you offending with each choice? What kind of ethnic signifiers are you giving by doing Kosova or Kosovo and so on throughout the volume? So we definitely had to struggle with this too. The European periphery didn't fly. The Western Balkans didn't fly because you have the Western and the Western Balkans. And I mean, in the end, we chose Southeast Europe, but this could also be a topic just of its own. So that really quickly. The other thing I wanted to say about surveys that's really interesting is that I started off with the ethnic distance scale that goes, don't want them in my country, would have them in my country, in my city, as neighbors, as colleagues, and then the closest is you would marry them. And the funny thing is that the Serbian youth, when they had this thing for Croats, a lot of the boys circle, don't want them in my country, right? And the way it's assumed is that if you select would marry, you would select all of the other ones, all of the other positive ones. So if you would marry them, you would also have them as a neighbor and a coworker, and going back. And then they would fill out all of the ones, but were circled would have as a boyfriend, girlfriend. And then I would have to drop that one because the scale can't have, right? You can't not have them in your country, but then have them as, and this just shows you how youth really do, like a lot of Serbian boys think Croatian girls are cool, right? And this is something that the survey won't help you realize, because for me that was an invalid survey response. But you have these things with youth where I think it's useful to have both, because without a survey you can't really do broad comparative stuff. But you're missing these nuances. Then I wanted to say about social media. I disagree with you. I think social media are pretty big. I have a much younger brother who now did his master's thesis on Instagram, and he went and looked at. I had nothing to do with his choice of topic at all. But he decided to look at the hash code Serbian hash code Croatian hashtag, and then he coded the pictures people would put when they would put Serbian or Hrvat. Or I think he dropped his gender thing because, anyway. And then let's say he definitely found that when you have hashtag Serbian, you had much more of these traditional church flags through fingers, whereas for Croatian, it kind of mirrors. It's the same thing I found, which is why I encouraged him to do this master's thesis. But then you could say, okay, so we have this finding. Serbian And on Instagram, there's a difference between Serbian and Croatian hashtags. And then again, it's like, so what? Because can we still argue that now if a nationalist politician mobilizes Croatian youth, he'll be less successful because they put hashtag Croatian on pictures of the sea? I don't know, right? Because that's what we're trying to say. Oh, look, they're not being ethno-nationalistic. They're putting pictures of the sea and they're putting pictures of forests. But does that really mean that? Because actually the implied notion is if they don't care about their national identity, they're less likely to be mobilized. There's less of a chance of ethnic war. And this is just kind of at the end of all these studies, we know that when mobilization for war comes up, all this stuff just gets, messed up anyway. So that's where I really find you have these persuasive findings and you still don't know if that really means anything more broadly. And I also want to say the discussion about youth being more or less tolerant. You see this in the US media also and everywhere with millennials. They're lazy, they come to work late, they expect whatever, all this stuff. But then there's this other counter argument that millennials are more tolerant and more open. And so you see for people who believe in generations in that sense. So there's also the sense of, okay, but youth could be the carriers of these more tolerant attitudes. And this is where I think that what Anna was asking about poverty and SES, I really do think that there is a difference because in the Balkans, the peculiarity is that youth who have higher educated parents could still be as poor as youth who have very low educated parents. So your parents could be professors, but your friend who has parents who are taxi drivers could be making more or having. So I think here it's actually really tricky because I think in the Balkans there is a special thing, a special class dimension that differs them regardless of the poverty. So when I did interviews and asked kids in the best Serbian high school and in the worst, like lowest ranked vocational school, let's say where kids are going to be, let's say butchers or bakers. So if you take the highest socioeconomic, future socioeconomic extreme, and I would say, who are your three most positive Serbs and who are the three most negative Serbs, and it's the same thing in Croatia. You had the reverse list, completely reverse order. So the top three most negative in the high school or gymnasia were the top three most positive in the vocational school. And also in the vocational school, they talked much more about hating police and how they can't wear their hoodies and not be harassed on the street and all these things the kids in the gymnasia never told me, right? So they have a completely different lived experience of their poverty than the kids who have parents who are university professors but are equally as poor, right? So I think that it's not just poverty. I think that actual social class is coming in here in a really particular way. And it's really too bad nobody is studying it because it's kind of like a class communist thing. And actually the social class and how much prestige you have, even as a super poor living with your grandparents, kid of college professors, is very different in terms of your social prestige than somebody. So I think that thing with poverty and socioeconomic class really needs to be teased out much more by other research. So I'll stop there.
It's a fascinating book. I very much look forward to reading it. I had two thoughts by myself when I was listening, and I'm sorry I came a little bit late, I was somewhere else. One question is whether you have looked at all into whether there is any governmental agency or anyone else that is trying purposefully to reinforce what you call as a youth solidarity. And hereby I'm specifically thinking about, on one hand, teaching, curriculum in the schools that presents history and the whole region in one way or another one, so part of the education policy and specific curriculum in the primary schools and the high schools. And the other one is mobility programs. And I'm thinking about mobility programs because I started off as a European studies major, and what we know how European Union came about is that first there were exchanges of youth between Germany and France, and then later on we had the Erasmus program, and all of that had one particular idea of transcending the borders and bringing those young people together. So I'm also wondering if you have encountered any of those programs that would be promoting and trying to reinforce what you quote as a youth solidarity, and if it is, by whom is that done? Is would the governments do it, or is this international organizations that would intervene in this space? That's what I'm wondering about.
Are there any other questions? There's the last one.
When reading this book, I couldn't help applying what I've seen there and comparing what I've seen there to my country, which is Ukraine, where the war is happening right now, and young people feel very much associate themselves with what's happening. So even though you mentioned a lot how you came to this book out of some sadness and despair for what happened in your country, I felt sort of envious because I was looking at young people saying that we don't find this war something relevant for us. We want to just continue living our lives, and this is what our parents did, and we don't want to be responsible for that. And all these kinds of these ideas. So I wonder what it takes to young people to begin thinking this way. Should it be the next generation, or just some time to pass, or the war to end, or some particular effort towards that? Because from my point of view, this is already sort of success in society. That
Can we answer first and then
Sure. No, so I also want to, I didn't want to make the binary where everybody's super negative about youth, but we're offering a volume that's super positive. It's definitely not like that. It's more, we have had enough studies on how to mobilize youth ethno-nationalistically, but let's look at the situations in which they transcend them. So it could be the same boy who's super nationalistic in some context, but in what context is he less, or in what context do these post-ethnic identities actually matter? So it's not saying overall we're positive or overall we're optimistic, but it's more, it is happening in some situation, in some circumstances, and in others, other identifications are more important. And let's try to really kind of disentangle in which situations is ethnic identity less relevant than others, instead of assuming it's everywhere. Otherwise, I don't think, overall, if you ask me optimistic versus pessimistic, I'm probably more on the negative side, but it's still, I think there's value in studying the situations in which other kinds of identifications are being fostered. And I think Erasmus here and the mobility programs, I mentioned that at the beginning, are really, really hugely relevant. And in terms of, even my little brother and sister who were brought up in an upper class family, if you want to say like that, when they were visiting me, I said, do you guys want to go to Venice? And they're like, Venice? For them, anything, because they were brought up, this is a generation 20-year-olds who really didn't get to travel anywhere. They still have this closed mindset where it's really difficult to imagine you can just sit on a bus and go to Venice. And this is now happening, that the borders are opening, and we really need to study the ways in which the previous, you were Serb, but you also couldn't go anywhere outside of Serbia. And there was a middle generation that was like that didn't get to travel, to the new youth who don't have these blinders where you're Serb, but you have to stay here. They have it more open. They can go and come back. It's not just brain drain. They can actually go visit and then come back to Serbia. And it's a very different mindset that these children have. And I think this is what we need to now see, the youth that were brought up in these post-war years, in what ways are they actually developing these categories?
I'm curious what Mary and Barbara think. I don't have much to add.
Well, nothing much. Only one thing about the passage of time, honestly. It seems to me that the passage of time is only a precondition and nothing more than that. I mean, surely after some huge trauma or social clash or upheaval, you can't expect any huge change overnight. But it was a common fallacy, some sort of idea that time on its own is going to heal any wound. So time is simply a precondition. It can easily happen if nobody does anything. There are people who do things in an untimely fashion. For instance, immediately after some upheaval. And it seems that they're working against the current. But to my mind, they're frequently passing a torch to somebody else who's going to work on their legacy, basically re-narrating what they did in much more positive context. So time, a precondition. Regarding traveling, I would also say it's just a precondition. The generation which destroyed Yugoslavia was one of the most cosmopolitan generation that the Balkans actually created. I don't know how and why it happened, but people who were actually conscripted to different militaries in the early 90s were much more cosmopolitan than any generation before or any generation after. They were listening to rock, punk, post-punk, this and that, traveling a lot as much as possible. So again, traveling, just a precondition. So many things which we take for granted are just preconditions of social change.
Although I did find in my other statistical work, which I'm less proud of, I did find a correlation between when people are older, people are asked in surveys, have you been outside of Croatia, and their ethnic distance scale is definitely negatively correlated. So the more you've traveled, the more tolerant you are. Sure. There is a relationship there. Hmm?
The more people travel to your country, the more you see diversity.
And that too, yeah.
The threat perceptions.
And
I mean,
if I'm allowed with one more comment, actually, the political organization regarding the age, which is what Danilo brought up, actually it is happening in a number of Balkan countries. Successfully, parties of retired people are coming into existence. And sometimes they really tip the balance. I mean, one of such parties was in a coalition government in Serbia for a decade. It slowed social reform by and large for very, very many different reasons. So this is the question. So how come that you can make a party of retired people, which is passing the threshold of 5% and being a political player, and you can't make a party of young people who are asking for their part of a social
they're a minority.
of a social cake.
But that's the demographic thing. They're all like so all these countries, with the exception of Kosovo, they're all getting old, but not in the way China is getting old. I'm not getting old with the brain drain plus the low birth rate is a situation where these young people are such a minority that must also factor into it.
So what about this question of is there anyone mobilizing or reinforcing the youth identity? Are there organizations? Are there governments?
There are.
Education system?
I mean, to go back to my example, like I may not sound it, but I'm much more hopeful and optimistic maybe than I said. So look at this guy. I just think we need to lower our threshold for success a little bit, because of course if we take the Western European American standards for when's that threshold for a proper cosmopolitan dialogue, we're not going to get very far.
Well, we're
But
lowering the bar
we
every
are,
day.
yeah, which is not to say we're lowering, but for example, this guy who I had this revelation. It might sound stupid, but I really had a revelation where our entire communication on the superficial level was very ethnically hostile. But that missed this bigger point that he was talking the talk, but he put his physical safety on the line for me and two other people. He didn't have to do that. See, that in a sense, how do we, there's an interpretive problem there. I agree there's like this selection bias problem of like what part of it do we focus on? But there's also a problem of like this concrete example, like ethnographically, what part of that should I pay attention to? Because initially I just listened to what he was saying after we got in, but I missed the point that the mere fact that he came to Belgrade and that he allowed us to come in a situation where people are pointing guns at him and at us. And that's no small feat. So the fact that there are people, and maybe there are groups, there's the Youth Initiative for Human Rights, which did this a lot. There's that group by Liza Shurlino's that's bringing people, something as simple as bringing them to the capital from the various, like from Novi Pazar, for example, from Croatia to Serbia and back. Mostar, there are groups, very important groups in Mostar that are moving between the ethnic divide and so on. You can laugh at that because, of course, their impact looks pitiful compared to what somebody in France is doing between the Algerian immigrants and the French racists. Of course, it's going to be very modest. But in that, I would not downplay it, especially because, and I do agree with Tamara that the travel is critical. I think it's the cure for everything. Of course, there's selection bias is easy. Selection bias is, of course, easy, and most of the traveling, to go back to Kosovo, is Serbs visiting poor, victimized Serbs in enclaves and hearing stories about Albanian aggression, and most of the Kosovars moving anywhere into Serbia, going to Preševo, that's not the kind of travel we want. But you need the brave travel. That really is putting them in the room and seeing the human. I think that's really the panacea. I really do.
There is actually, if I could add, a Harvard undergraduate who, as a part of her senior thesis project, organized a youth school in Mostar, and that school is still functioning. Now it's been, I think, the 5th year, and it's a modest project, but actually a very important one. The piece is actually won a Books Prize. So, and your volume probably was already in the editing stages when the curricular reform in Croatia started. I must say that begs a little question. I'm not very optimistic about curricular reforms because they're of course framed in all kinds of political agendas, and that law came originally Croatian, and I don't see much progress. But in terms of various, youth political groupations in Croatia, we saw Živi Most as anarchist as they seem to be. We saw Živi Zid, sorry, and also we saw Most, which again has its own specific agenda, but it seems like there is some sort of organizing that's coming from that end, and where it's going to go, it remains to be seen, but at least it's happening. And on the third account, in terms of traveling, it's been easier to travel in Croatia than maybe in some other parts of the region. But also, we've seen this phenomenon of the world coming to at least the Croatian coast, and the youth being exposed to all kinds of different behaviors and interests and so forth. And I think we can actually say that it has affected them in the sense that trying to find our footing in that world, and also connecting on all kinds of social levels and education levels. What saddens me, and that was the beginning actually of your presentation, the lack of role models, and how much the education is devalued, and how much sport, fame, and sort of achieve whatever level of cerebral pork and what these kinds of phenomena are hyper propelled to the all kinds of societal spheres. So I mean, the educational institution, and then to see that there is really no forum, there no agreement, and no orchestrated effort to produce role models, that is something that we all need to be worried about.
Yeah.
So that's
Just inspired me to maybe share one anecdote very, very briefly. Recently organized students' parliament, and it was on debate science. So the idea was to introduce evidence-based policies. So we had winners of all championships in math and sciences and so on, the best and the brightest in the parliament. And it happened that one of the hosts was the president of the Committee on Science and Research in the parliament for the ruling party, that gave kind of very patriotic speech saying you should not leave your country, you should be patriots, you should love Serbia, and we will help you, and so on and so on. And he continued. And then after that, a young, brilliant boy stood up and said, in a very calm way, we do understand and appreciate very much, and I think that we are all patriots here, but can you tell me, where is the proof that Serbia loves us? And it was, I mean, I cannot replicate that. I remember that, and I remember that several times while you were talking. It was really striking. And to the question that our Ukrainian colleague answered, I want to ask you, have you experienced that kind of fatigue and disappointment in politics and politicians? Because obviously the message that young group of people wanted to convey is, stop telling us that you love us because you're corrupt, you do not appreciate education, you have fake diplomas, that's another question, that's for another debate, so it's completely devalued. And I think that by understanding that they are fed up with political elites and those ruling parties that have huge majorities in most of the countries, they basically are disengaged. So the thing is how we could go forward from that point, and how politics relates to all the issues that you mentioned, seen economic plus topics, but what about fragile democracy? Call them.
No, actually, if we wanted, this volume could easily have also been on the topic of political engagement, because this question of political apathy or political engagement comes up in every single chapter. It was never the focus, but in mine it was great political apathy, and some of the chapters also focused on how those youth who were politically active did get a sense of these post-ethnic identities, but in other ones, especially in the Macedonian chapter and Albanian chapter, politics was simply how to get a job. So you join a party, so it's easier to get a job. And in my own interviews, the fatigue with politics was huge. So, and that's one of the questions that I do think needs to be for the next volume. In which case can political engagement actually foster this kind of, I mean, I don't know if you found it. It wasn't a central question, but it really comes up in every single chapter.
Like waste of time to be engaged in politics is distracting them from education. That was how we felt.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Study how much they're optimist or pessimist about the perspective, because as you mentioned before, similarity in the United States. Now we go to Skipani there, and we were discussing economic situation, but we say now how it was fantastically good economically. But I was living there, and I remember late 80s. It was total pessimism. One of the jokes was, says pessimists say we touched the bottom. Optimist says no, we haven't yet. So it was total pessimism, and also, in my opinion, one of the breaking points was when people realized we are not going to enter European Union in late 80s. And then everything collapsed, and then since someone has to be guilty, so obviously not us, some other guys, is it immigrants, Muslims, Croats, Serbs, Muslims, Kosoars, somebody else is guilty, so that's what happened. But the main reason is total loss of optimism and somehow belief. And the similarity with the American situation is who voted for Trump, people who feel they have no perspective. They are doomed. So I think whole Yugoslav population, I mean, not whole, but big majority thought the situation is hopeless.
Before the civil wars.
Yeah. Late 80s. Late 80s, where economy was by our today's standards fantastic. So Serbia has not reached this yet. Slovenia reached it after 20 years. Croatia, I don't know, even later. So 89 economy GDP was reached, I don't know, Slovenia, something like 20 years later. Croatia 25 years later. And Serbia not yet. So it's not what the economy is and how much poor people are, but what they expect and what they believe, and do they see any hope?
It's a relative
In
generation theory.
that sense, I'm asking, did you study how they view situation? Is there any hope or is there no hope?
Well, I actually asked the question, where do you see Serbia or where do you see Croatia in 10 years from now? And when I started doing the interviews, they weren't in the European Union. Croatia wasn't in the European Union, and in the second half that it was. And here I saw when the youth's version of the future was always framed in terms of EU or non-EU. Although the actual understanding of the EU is really, really low in terms of, oh, there'll be cleaner streets, something about traveling, but there's no real sense of, I mean, I found much more pessimism in terms of expectations for the next 10 years. And again, in terms of, are you leaving the country or you're not? So are you planning on leaving, or do you have a way to leave or not, to emigrate? So.
Yeah. What was that? Hopeless but not that? No, desperate but not hopeless. What was the expression?
Well, maybe that's a good point too.
No. We mustn't end there.
We started a whole new study, I think, with the previous question, so more work to come. Hopefully, another interesting volume. And thank you very much for offering your results of the research, and thank you to our audience for the wonderful questions.
Thank you for the questions.